In 2001, the Centenary of Federation year, the organising committee of that celebration mounted a very successful advertising campaign. They simply asked, with a shaming device, what sort of country doesn't know the name of its own first Prime Minister? Well, the device was successful. We learnt that name, we learnt that Prime Minister. It was this man, Edmund Barton.
And who was the first Prime Minister of Australia?
Can't ask your mother.
Mum!
What kind of country would forget the name of its first Prime Minister?
I've got no idea.
Couldn't tell you. Haven't a clue.
I don't know.
I think it was Barton.
Edmund Barton.
It was Edmund Barton.
I knew that.
But we didn't learn a whole lot more about him. In truth, the humanising stories of Federation and its founders failed to get any real community traction. Did we learn, for example, that Barton's nickname in the press of the day was Tosspot Toby? Did we learn that he was extremely fond, as his biographer Geoffrey Bolton delicately puts it, of the pleasures of the table? Did we learn that he was a better than useful cricketer with match experience against some of the best Australian cricketers of the era? Legends such as Charlie Bannerman, Murdoch and the Gregories. He even looked down the 22 yards at this terrifying sight, the 19th century's Dennis Lillee, Fred the Demon Spofford himself. In later years, Edmund Barton umpired one of Australian cricket's most controversial matches. In 1879, when George Robert, the fourth Earl Harris, led his team off the field against a New South Wales 11 amidst accusations of convict larrikinism amongst the restless Australian crowd. Did we absorb anything about our first Prime Minister beyond his name? I suspect the answer to that question as a nation is no. Now, in the coming weeks on Stateline, I would like to go behind the scenes, behind the headlines, to try and find the hidden history of Canberra's big centenary years, 1908 to 1913, 2008 to 2013, the key personalities, the high-profile politicians and the momentous events they shaped, the quirks of character, an event that you are likely to remember. So I'm going to locate some of the human stories, and to do that, I get to spend some time digging around in the collections of our most loved treasure house cultural institutions, the National Film and Sound Archive, the National Library of Australia, and in this fine old John Smith Murdoch building behind me, the National Archives of Australia. I can't wait. Let's go. On the 12th of March 1913, now remembered and celebrated as Canberra Day, on Capitol Hill, on a podium erected just about where the Parliament House is today, the Governor-General's wife, Lady Denman, announced to Australia and to the world that the name for the new Australian capital city would be Canberra. The foundation stones were laid with golden trowels in front of a big and boisterous crowd. On the podium, alongside Lady Denman, were her husband, the Governor-General Lord Denman, the Labor Prime Minister of Australia, Andrew Fisher, the Minister for Home Affairs, the irrepressible King O'Malley, destined to loom large in our story, and the Attorney General and controversial future Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, the Little Digger. Looking north at the actual location of the new capital on that 1913 day, the dignitaries present might have been forgiven if they lacked the necessary imagination. Yes, Denman, Fisher and O'Malley all predictably described the site and its future prospects with great enthusiasm and a highly creative vision of the future. But there must have been many citizens of the new nation there that day who couldn't help but be persuaded by the evidence of their own eyes. For stretched out in front of them, as they promenaded north, down the hill, towards what is now Civic, on that dusty autumn day in Canberra, was a practically bare plain, interrupted only occasionally by bits of a river that in Europe would not have been flattered with the name stream. Lord Denman arrived on his regal charger and his entourage amidst much fanfare and clouds of fine-grain Monero dust. The 21-gun salute threatened to develop into a sandstorm. Why had the decision been made to site the new capital here? Who made it? What motivated them? Who and what influenced them? And when did the story start? These are questions that I'm hoping to answer for you in the coming weeks and months. On the 14th of December 1908, 100 years ago this December, Yass Canberra was confirmed by royal assent as the area to host the new capital city. This particular seat of government act of the Commonwealth Parliament brought to an end an absorbing, if exhausting, process that lasted nearly 20 years, commencing at the beginning of the 1890s. Canberra's birth, I can assure you, was no easy delivery. Before this epic two-decade Battle of the Sites was over, to produce the remarkable city that you have laid out behind me under the fog, it had involved no less than 7 Commonwealth governments, 5 New South Wales governments, 2 Royal Commissions, and a total of 9 Ministers for Home Affairs, 4 lapsed bills, and 3 acts of the Commonwealth Parliament. The process could be said to have started with 2 important political events. First, the Australasian Federation Conference in Melbourne in February 1890, where Sir Henry Parkes, that grand old charlatan of a man, rallied infant national sentiment 10 years before Federation with his memorable reference to the crimson thread that unites us all. While Victoria's Alfred Deakin at the same conference spoke loftily of the Australian colonies as a people one in blood, race, religion and aspirations. The second and far more significant meeting was the National Australasian Convention, held in Sydney in March-April 1891, which adopted a draft bill to constitute the Commonwealth of Australia. The bill was a crucial step in the Federation march, but the Federation fathers, and they were all men at this convention with prodigious amounts of fashionable facial hair, these founders wisely postponed any decision on what South Australia's Richard Chaffee Baker called the burning question, namely the question of a national capital site. It was a deft delay, but it only served to encourage continental aspiration. Towns right across Australia were effectively given the green light to begin fancying their chances. No town was excluded. What started almost immediately was an energetic, though sometimes undignified, scramble by a host of towns and cities, big and small, to assert their unique claims to being the nation's capital. Propaganda booklets such as these popped up like mushrooms. The cocky residents of the 2 powerhouses, Sydney and Melbourne, thought they were certainties. But then so too did the good citizens, the ambitious burghers, as Ian Warden would call them, of Ballarat and Bendigo, of Bathurst and Bombala, of Albury and Armidale. In South Australia, both Port Augusta and Mount Gambier brashly talked up their claims, while in Queensland, a Burdekin River site way west of Townsville was the subject of a quietly confident article in the Bulletin. And believe it or not, a similar claim was made for an area west of Queensland's Cunnamulla, at what we now call Cameron's Corner, on the remote and arid borders of Queensland, New South Wales and South Australia. Obviously, no town, no spot, no area was ruled out amidst the ambition, hope and barely suppressed euphoria of the 1890s. But a secret deal at the hastily convened Colonial Premiers' Conference of January-February 1899 changed the game, when that experienced and cunning showman, New South Wales Premier George Reid, played his trump card. The threat that if New South Wales, the self-ascribed mother colony, did not get the nod to host the capital, then quite simply, it would not agree to be a part of the Australian Federation. This was crude gunboat politics, but it obtained the desired result. A rewriting of the relevant part of the Constitution draft, section 125, to read, the seat of government of the Commonwealth shall be determined by the Parliament, and shall be in New South Wales and be distant not less than 100 miles from Sydney. Yes, the capital would be in New South Wales, but the other states had made certain that it would not be in Sydney. And more, until there was such a capital, the Victorians secured the deal that Melbourne would be the temporary site. Many Melburnians were soon of the opinion that their sizeable foot in the Section 125 door would eventually get them the capital permanently. And so the draft constitution, with these very specific national capital clauses, was signed into British law by the Parliament and Queen Victoria in July 1900. The leading Australian politicians of the day, among them Edmund Barton, Deakin and Charles Kingston, revelled in their triumph. It has been said that after the vote, they retired with appropriate dignity and decorum to a Westminster committee room, whereupon they joined hands and danced a jig of unbounded celebration. Australia had its federation, its constitution and its Section 125. What began then was the second and far more formidable story in the Battle of the Sites, when for 6 more years, 1902 to 1908, a newly energised bunch of New South Wales towns began to assert their fresh claims to being Australia's new capital city. It was a battle fought as tigerishly and as tactically as any wartime engagement. But right from the start, in 1901 too, the rules of the battle were well understood by the combatants. 1, the site would be inland, for a coastal city risked both the outbreak of disease and bombardment from foreign ships. 2, the site must have a plentiful water supply. 3, the site must be a beautiful one, a place where nature could elevate and inspire, a place combining the attributes of the city beautiful and the garden city. And 4, and perhaps most significantly at the time, the site must be in a cold region. The belief of the era, which assumed the proportions of universal truth, was that the Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Celtic intelligence could only thrive in a cold climate. Yes, you've got it, whites thought best in the frost and the snow. I'm tempted to boast to the rest of Australia these days that is why Canberra leads the country on all performance indicators, but somehow I don't think it's going to fly in 2008. What the cold climate myth meant back in the first years of the new 20th century was that the likes of Port Macquarie and beautiful Byron Bay were goners. The Federation founders, in search of their ideal national capital, looked northwest to Armidale, west to Orange, and especially straight south for inspiration. Mountains, not beaches, were the fashion of the time in an Australia still very, very British. Let's finish our first segment with a watercolour by Sydney architect and artist in the Federation period, Charles Coulter. In a response to a request by a friend, Mr Evans, who had written a paper proposing our own Lake George as the best site for the coming capital, Coulter produced this remarkable bit of national capital history. In 1901, Evans imagined Lake George, to use his own phrase, as Australia's new Venice. And Charles Coulter drew it for him, complete with classical architecture, sylvan shores, tranquil, plentiful waters, and, perhaps as a gesture to the true local, 1 or 2 guns. Expansive myths and myth-making in this battle of the sites had begun in earnest. In my next Stateline segment in 4 weeks' time, I'll do my best to puncture a few of the best of them.